1991, when we started going on the de-licensing mode, when we wanted to, this is where we are trying to understand the growth, understand the developmental perspective altogether. India started at 1951 to 56. In 1958, there were 26,000 communities. Look at the 10th five-year plan. Then we came over the 11th, 12th, and now we are on the 13th five-year plan in the minimum support price. So the government will set a minimum price. Good morning and welcome to the second session of Chapter 10, the Comparative Development Experience of India and its Neighbours. In the previous chapter, we just introduced you to the concept of development on a comparative basis. So in this session, we are going to look into the development path in a full form, and plus we are going to analyze the countries in detail. So let's move forward and try to understand what are the different factors for today. Right, so we have started this topic for today with developmental path, a snapshot view, and we are going to speak about an important country called as China. So these two are the topics today. So we are going to have a complete insight view of the development path, followed by China, our greatest neighbor, and how has been the development of China. Moving forward. Now, what has been the developmental path for India? While India announced its first five-year plan in 1951-56, Pakistan announced its first five-year plan called as a medium-term plan in 1956. Now, you can see the similarities here. India started at 1951 to 56. Pakistan also joined us in 1956. So that is the most important factor. So almost everybody started thinking about development at the same time. But what was the difference here that you need to understand and appreciate is that India made a rapid progress step by step because it was able to understand that every five-year plan needs to improve, needs to come up with something better than what we predicted. So that's why our five-year plan was comparatively better than that of Pakistan. Now, China announced its first five-year plan in 1953. So closely following 1953, we also see that China came up with its first plan. So what we are able to understand here is that, look at the factors. In the 50s, India, China, Pakistan, all the three have the same agenda in the mind. They might have not discussed it together, but this is what they wanted to do together. This is what they wanted to think when they wanted to move on the developmental path. Till 1998, I want you to remember this year. Why? Because Pakistan had 8 five-year plan, whereas China's 10th five-year period plan was between 2001 and 6. So there, China took a lead over Pakistan. Though Pakistan was standing on the 8th five-year plan, China was already on the 10th five-year plan. That means their planning was ahead of Pakistan. They had immediately thought about growth at a higher level, at a higher pace altogether. The current planning Commission in India is based on 10th. To be very precise, I would tell you that we are on the 13th five-year plan altogether, and that was actually the most important factor for us. Why? Because if I just date myself to 2002, 2007, yes, that was the 10th five-year plan, then we came over the 11th, 12th, and now we are on the 13th five-year plan in the current trend altogether. India and Pakistan had adopted similar strategies such as developing the large public sector, raising a lot of importance and investment for the public sector. Now, if you start avoiding China for a moment and start comparing India and Pakistan, our ideology was the same. We wanted to see that both the countries had a similar kind of factor, had a similar kind of growth strategy altogether. So both of us started concentrating on the public sector. Both of us started concentrating on the growth aspect altogether. We want the public sector to develop. We want the public sector to become even more stronger on the day-to-day basis. So that is one of the reasons why we started thinking in the same aspects, in the same line altogether. Now, India at the first level wanted to see that the public sector becomes stronger and stronger. That's because they wanted to ensure its citizens a complete job security. They wanted to give their citizens a better hope of understanding. So that is how they started coming into that picture, followed by Pakistan, which also started thinking in the same line. So our ideology to improve the public sector union was definitely admired and definitely thought about in the long term. Now, moving forward, till the 1980s, this year also I want you to remember, because this was the time when all the three countries had similar growth rates and the per capita income. Just look at the fantastic part of this situation altogether. All the three countries having the similar growth rate, similar ideology, similar per capita income. It looks so fantastic altogether. Why? Because though the countries are different, the diversity is different, the culture is different, the ideology is different, but look at the factor that both of them are, or the three of them are standing on the same platform. Now, where do they stand today in comparison to one another? That's the question that we need to start analyzing for today. That is the most important factor. Till the 80s, yes, we were all together. But 40 years from now, from the 1980, we are today standing in a different platform, in a different league. India and China are neck to neck in each other. I would even say that India overtook China in terms of economic development, in terms of GDP last year. And today, India and China are racing to become the world's largest manufacturing hub when compared to Pakistan. But we answer this question from a textual standpoint. Let us trace the historical path of developmental policies in China and Pakistan. We know India. We know for sure that what India has made in terms of development. But we want to understand this question more from a China and Pakistan perspective. And this is purely textual in nature. So even before we go into the practicalities, even before we go into the actual statistics, let us try to understand China and Pakistan as close as possible. After studying the last 3 units, we already know what policies India has been adopting since its independence. So this is very, very important for all of us. This is where we are trying to understand the growth, understand the developmental perspective altogether. What we are seeing in the long run, or what we are trying to understand in the long run, is that we have been adopting the policy of sustainable development. We have been adopting the policy of better employment. We have also been trying to adopt the policy of eradicating poverty and go more towards a technology-oriented nation. So our policies are very, very conducive for the growth of environment, and we have been always trying to come up with a better understanding, a better psychology altogether. So that is where we are moving towards in terms of development. That is where we are moving in terms of growth altogether. Now, after the establishment of People's Republic of China, now we are going to speak about the greatest nation in terms of population. I would not like to glorify the nation further by giving adjectives, but definitely, yes, we have to understand and admit the fact that India is the world's largest in terms of manufacturing, and China is the world's largest in terms of population. So I would like to give the adjective to China as the world's largest populated country. Now, after the establishment of People's Republic of China under one-party system rule, all the critical sectors of the economy, including the enterprises and lands that were owned by individuals, were brought under government control. I want you to understand the word government control, which means to say that somewhere down the lane, China started adopting the policy of centralized theory. They wanted to hold the power. They wanted to become a centrally planned economy where all the activities, where all the directions, where all the decisions are taken up by the government. So they are becoming a country which is holding the raw power under their hands, and that's what they are. If you look into the picture, if you look into the system altogether, they are completely holding the control in their hands. The great leader Leap Forward, GLF campaign, that was initiated in the year 1958, aimed at industrializing the country on a massive scale. So this is very, very important. The Great Leap Forward, which was started in the year 1958, that was very, very important for us. Why? Because 1958 was the year for China to start getting into a complete developmental experience or an ideology altogether. People were encouraged to set up their industries in their backyards, which means to say that typically you could have just started a company in China at your home itself, and just with the available space with you. In the rural areas, lot of communes were started, which means the community was started and people started developing themselves. Now, what is the most important factor for us to know here is that entrepreneurship. China was the first and foremost promoter of entrepreneurship, and that started 60, 70 years before itself, because Chinese were the people who understood the importance of entrepreneurship, and they wanted their country to become a small-scale manufacturing hub way back in the 60s itself. Followed by which, under the commune system, people were collectively cultivating land. So look at the approach towards agriculture. They wanted to abolish the system of just holding one person becoming richer and richer. They wanted to bring in the community effect. So they gave agriculture a rephrased growth altogether. And that's how they started doing a group cultivation. In 1958, there were 26,000 communities. Look at the massive development that China has done altogether, covering almost all the farm population. So agriculture was definitely covered. Agriculture was just coming up in a big way in China altogether. And the GLF campaign met with many problems also. We are going to discuss about the problematic factors. But look at the developmental initiative that was taken up by China. One side, they were focusing on the industrial development. The other side, they are also focusing on the community development towards agriculture. Now, moving forward, there was a bad situation that happened in China, and that bad situation, or the most drastic thing that happened, was a severe drought which caused an havoc in China, killing about 30 million people. A very sad story. 30 million people were killed in China because of the drought. Now, once this kind of a natural disaster that happens, automatically it puts a break to the economy of the country. That is what we are experiencing today. After the pandemic that has happened in the current year, in the current scenario, you are able to see that the economy of the country has slowed down to a very great extent. And that is exactly what has happened in China ages back. Now, when Russia had conflicts with China, it withdrew its professionals who had earlier been sent to China to help in industrialization process. So the Chinese government was not friendly with everybody in the world. They had conflicts with every single government. Even with Russia, they had a problem. So the Russians had to go ahead and withdraw their people out who were trying to help them in the industrialization problem. So now, it is actually going on the backstage altogether. They are just going back and back because of the problems that are erupting in China. One side you had a drought, the other side you have a conflict, the other side your international relations are getting disturbed. So the Chinese development is now taking a backstage. Next, in 1965, Mao, one of the greatest reformists of China, introduced the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, under which the students and professionals were sent to work and learn from the countryside. Now, Mao Zedong is one of the greatest reformer of China. Every country has its own leader who has taken the path of development, who has taken the path of a revolution altogether, and Mao Zedong is no less in that. So in 1965, he just developed a movement through which every single student, youngsters, have to go back to the rural areas, start learning from there, and start getting into the work cycle. Basically, if you just try to understand this point, they came to that same level as what India did. they also started focusing on employment. India also wanted to do the same thing. Why? Because we also believe that once a country gets 100% employment cycle, then poverty can automatically be eradicated. With these two situations, where 30 million people getting their lives lost, when you have an industrialization process getting backlashed, all those factors happening, you see that you want to get back on track with employment. So that is where the revolutionary step was taken in terms of putting people back to work altogether, and that's what was Mao Zedong trying to come up with. The present day fast industrial growth process in China can be traced back to the year 1978. Why? Because the reforms were introduced in that year. China also introduced these reforms in phases. So definitely Chinese development process can be tracked to 40 years back when they first came up with something called as the cultural as well as the employment revolution. They wanted to change the mindset. They wanted to change the culture. They wanted to make every single person in China employed and start moving forward in that direction, and they have done it. So that is the most appreciable part of China altogether. Now, moving forward. In the initial phase, the reforms that were brought by China was not really appreciated. Why? Because they've had certain kinds of problem, but then just look at it, how they are able to overcome it. The initiation happened in the areas of agriculture, foreign trade and investment sectors. So they started looking into agriculture and foreign trade. Similarly, like India, because India opened up in 1991, the only difference is that China opened up in 1980s itself. So they started first concentrating on agriculture and international trade. In agriculture, for instance, community-based land development projects were divided into small plots, and they started promoting agriculture as a group activity. They wanted to give importance to the farmers. They wanted every single farmer to feel important about the factor that the land belongs to him, the revenue belongs to him, and he needs to start getting as an integrated community where agriculture can be developed as a life cycle process. The second thing is that they were allowed to keep all income from the land after paying a stipulated tax. So the revenue goes back to the cultivator. That's the most important thing. So now you are providing an incentive not only to the sector, but also to the people who are putting in that hard work in terms of development. So you need to understand the entire psychology here, that China wanted to empower its agricultures, empower the farmers altogether. They wanted to promote that sector not just from a job standpoint, but also from a passion standpoint, from an importance, from a priority standpoint, saying that it has to develop and it has to be the backbone of their sector. Followed by which the reforms were also initiated in the industrial sector. So once they had set the agriculture sector in place, they started now moving towards the industrial sector. Now, moving forward, private sector firms in general and township and village enterprises, those enterprises which were owned by and operated by local collectives, were allowed to produce the goods. So now what industrialization that China did exactly brought into picture was that they wanted to push the private sector. Exactly, again, we are going to repeat the same thing in India. 1991, when we started going on the de-licensing mode, when we wanted to remove the license Raj and we wanted to promote the private sector to come up because of employment and also because the local people will always get benefited. The same thing that you see in China here. They also did the same thing so that people would get employment, the local government will get a support, and there would be a lot of entrepreneurship that can be promoted. At this stage, enterprises owned by government were known as state-owned enterprises. The only name change in India is public sector enterprises, which we in India call as public sector enterprises. This is exactly the word which I was trying to say, were made face-to-face competition. This is something really exciting for us. Why? Because we are exactly coming on the same stages like that of China. The reform process is known as involved a dual pricing, which means to say that at both sides there was some cost, there was some involvement in terms of development. This means fixing the prices in two ways. Farmers and the industrial units were required to buy and sell fixed quantities of inputs and outputs on the basis of prices that were fixed by the government. Again, the same thing what we have been talking about as MSP, minimum support price. So the government will set a minimum price which has to be paid to the farmers, and the rest were purchased and sold at the market price. So the same thing what we had also followed for years altogether. Today, yes, we are trying to change the farmers bill, we are trying to bring in corporatization altogether on the agriculture. But then going back, India and China did not have anything dissimilarity. They had everything quite close, and they did exactly the same thing in terms of building up the agriculture as well as the industrial sector. Now, moving forward, over the years, what you have seen is that as production increased, the proportion of goods inputs transacted in the market also increased. So the trade and commerce, the manufacturing sector started going up very well for China. And this is very, very important. This is why, because they wanted to interact the foreign investor, they wanted to attract them, they wanted to bring in the foreign direct investment into their country, and that was one of the most important factors by which special economic zones were set up. So India is no new to this word. We also have something called as SEZ, known as special economic zones. This is available in Bangalore, it's available in Chennai, it's there in Mumbai, it's there in Ahmedabad, it's there in Hyderabad, it's also there in Noida, Delhi and Gurgaon. So we are no less to China, we are exactly on the same path. We are trying to follow the same way how to develop our economy. Moving forward, with this, we come to the conclusion of this session. Going forward, we will be trying to talk about the other nations' development and progress also. And we would also try to compare and contrast the various developmental policies taken up by India, China, and Pakistan. Until then, stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay enlightened. Thank you once again for joining me today.